Everyone has a story inside of them. But sometimes that story could end up being a self-limiting belief that stops you from leading yourself and others. So what is the correct way of doing it? Maybe it's to become a more conscious leader. And that's why I've invited our expert for today, who is an international keynote speaker, a leadership expert, and the author of the brand new book, which I've had the privilege of reading and working through, Lead Like Morpheus. Ian Hatton, thank you so much for joining us on the Write, Learn and Earn show, and welcome.
Thank you, Kim. It's so good to be here, and it's been a good journey together already.
It's been a wonderful time. I've learned so much about myself, about my team. And one of the beautiful things of working with you is that you really walk your talk. So very often we'll work on something, and besides the fact that you acknowledge the work I do, you also acknowledge every member of my team. And that's incredibly refreshing. Now, guests, I just want to let you know that when you get to the end of the show, we're going to put up a QR code for a giveaway that Ian has designed with the same care and love that he does with everything. A big question. I did watch the movie The Matrix, and that's because I love science fiction and fantasy, but not many people have seen the movie. Why lead like Morpheus?
Well, it's actually goes way before The Matrix.
Okay.
So the Morpheus is the Greek god of dreams, the one who awakens dreams. And long before The Matrix, Neil Gaiman wrote a picture book, comic book series called The Sandman, and the lead character there was also called Morpheus. And many people say that Morpheus of The Matrix was actually modeled on Neil Gaiman's Morpheus. So it long predates. Just by the way, I'm also a fan of science fiction and fantasy.
Excellent. Now, one of the things that I notice in the book, because you obviously deal with all kinds of leadership concepts, you mentioned that when you were having your best success in a certain area, it also brought with it big failure as well. And a lot of us have really difficult relationships with failure. How did that work out for you? How did you transition from having failure in your life to having success again?
Well, I can probably tell 100 stories about that, but I think specifically, if I look at my corporate career before I started doing what I've been doing now for 22 years, it concluded working for Microsoft. And in that time, I led probably one of the biggest successes of my career. And in fact, people still talk about it at Microsoft. And I led a team that was a total failure. And I think very often we learn as much, if not more, from our failures than we do from our successes. And that's very much that journey of becoming conscious. It's very easy to play the blame game when there's failure. In fact, I often come across leaders who, senior, they're leaders of leaders of leaders, and they're constantly blaming their leaders or the economy or their people, instead of looking inside to say, what could I do differently? And so that sense of ownership is critical. For me, the biggest transition, though, was personal failures that resulted in me exploring a lot more about myself, becoming more conscious and aware of myself, and immediately noticing I was having a bigger impact than I had been.
So one of the things that you've got in there is with the hand, and you mentioned that the thumb is your mindset and that it touches every other area. Now, that was quite an eye-opener for me, because I do believe in mindset, but it was just such a simple way of looking at it. One of the things that also came up in there was the concept of time. Now, that really intrigued me, because when I deal with my book coaching clients, the excuse that they always use, and the thing that gets the blame, is time. But inside this book, you had an example of someone who felt he didn't have time for his staff. Just tell us a little bit about that story, that the readers can, or the viewers can hear about that.
So it's one of my favorite stories. I was doing some leadership development work, brilliant concepts I was training, but this one guy was pushing back all the time. He said, I don't have time. And specifically, we were talking about the one-on-one time that we need with our people. And eventually I just said, can we just stop this whole class? Let's just pause on this issue because it's a very real issue for everybody here. And we said, okay, let's have a look. How long does it take to do a decent one-on-one? And the research is pretty clear, and this is not even virtual, this is face-to-face. Typically 15 to 30 minutes is a good one-on-one. And so I said, okay, let's take the extreme of 30. And how many team members? Well, he said, well, he only has 4. And I said, well, let's talk about the rest of the room. Oh, no, there's an average of maybe 8. So, okay, fine. So 8 times 30, that's 4 hours. And you do that twice a month, that's 8 hours. How many hours do you work? And they all said no more than 200. So I said, we're talking 4%. You're telling me you don't have 4%. And what message does it send your people if you can't give them 4% of your time as a leader? And everybody's eyes went wide. And the next morning, because I invite people even on day one, I say, think about this more as mindset change than as education, as knowledge and skill. And the next morning I said, anybody want to share a mindset change? And this guy put up his hand and he said he'd like to say in front of everybody that the issue was never not having enough time. The issue was his people were not important enough to him. And he will never again use that excuse. And at that point, I don't care how much of the theory he learned. The mindset change meant he was going to be a better leader.
I love that, and particularly if I go back to the author space, the writing space, I used to follow Mel Robbins for a while, and she used to say, in terms of the writing, but not just writing, anything that is important to you, dedicate the first part of your day of it before you start responding to things around you, because that's really going to show you that you are important, that your dreams are important. And that's why I write early in the morning, because that's before I touch anything else. But on that point, it is all about self-leadership, and that's something that you teach. Tell us a little bit about the difference between normal leadership and self-leadership, and why self-leadership is so critical.
So one of the things for me personally is that I avoided the concept of self-leadership for a very long time. And if I go back and reflect on the failures I've had in leadership, it's always been because I've avoided self-leadership. The reason I avoided self-leadership is quite humorous, and the dramatic change that happened in my life in 2011 when I turned that around was about, I thought, because I lacked self-control, I couldn't ever say I'm a self-leader. And one day I woke up and know that I've never taught that leadership is control. Leadership is influence. So surely self-leadership is self-influence, not self-control. And of course later, there's a ton of research around willpower actually is a very finite, limited resource. And if we rely on it, we actually are going to fail. We need other mechanisms of influence. And so I finally embraced the idea of self-leadership. I coined a phrase, which we actually talk about in the game plan, which is, my number one job today is me.
Yes.
And that people immediately think, well, that sounds selfish. Not at all. Where do we nurture the capacity to lead others? Where do we nurture the capacity to love others? It can only start by nurturing it in ourselves. And so that became my ritual, my process, and immediately the impact I was having increased, and the sustainability increased. And that I then began to realize is actually the substance of all great leadership.
Yes.
Authentic leadership. How can we be authentic if we're not leading ourselves? How can we expect others to follow us if we won't even follow us?
And I was saying to someone the other day that she was struggling with all the different kinds of issues that she had. And I said, you wouldn't get in your car and drive from Johannesburg to Cape Town with no petrol in the car. You wouldn't drive that car without changing the tires. So why is it that you cannot do self-care? Because essentially that's your fuel to help you. I know for myself, if I haven't slept well, not eating well, I get snappy with the people around me, and then you're not a good leader. Now, just from a writing perspective, many self-published authors, they don't have people working for them. They have a team. Sometimes those team, they're suppliers. Do you have any advice for them on how they would work with that team when they don't have any financial incentive other than they're getting paid for the job? How do you inspire vision for those people to help you achieve your vision?
So for me, this is essential because I consider myself much more of a speaker than a writer.
Yes.
And so my journey began some more than 15 years ago, where people kept saying to me, Ian, you've got to write this down. You've got to write this down. And I'm like, I'm not comfortable writing. In fact, handwriting, I'm terrible with my handwriting. I can't read my own handwriting, and the whole struggle. But I heard them. They were saying they want something that's going to last longer than the conversation we had. So eventually I started doing a bit of blogging, and then there was this brainwave that Marie had, which was, why not take the videos you're making, Ian, and turn them into a book? And that began then this new process, which has been 2.5 years in the making to get this book ready. But we took very recent video content, transcribed it, and that was what the team did. So the team literally picked up the ball and ran with that, and they caught the vision for it, and realized how important it was. We made many mistakes along the road, and if I can give one piece of advice to everybody, speak to Kim first. Wish we'd done that earlier. And what resulted then is we got my designer involved, and she's been so far behind so much of what we've done. Incredible graphics. I think there's something like 146 graphics in the book, of which I think about 40 are full page, and so all of this started to come together, but in hindsight, in the wrong sequence. And that's where I wish we'd done a bit more research before we started and had conversations with you, because what we ended up doing was a complete re-edit after the book was finished, which meant we had to have the different publishing formats redone and all of that. But the whole idea of the team was, the team were all people who believed in me and believed in my message. And I think just over time, the authenticity, the fact that they can see the Morpheus in me, really inspired them to work long and hard on it. And I'm eternally grateful.
So am I, because I have to say, I try and practice that thing that I am the job and that I work on myself, but I still find myself slipping up in certain areas. And just reading this, like I started, your story actually affects the way that you pitch up, that you self-lead, and that you lead others. Have you seen any transitions that stand out? Because I know you've had a lot of transitions, but any transitions that have stood out to you when someone has actually claimed what their story is and how it affects them in the way that they influence other people?
There's so many. But the first one that came to mind was actually Cindy. Cindy was instrumental in transcribing the videos and getting the book to the point where I could then pick it up and make it my own. And Cindy's story is very interesting because Cindy was a client and a service provider to me. And her story is how her parenting changed. And as she went on the inner journey, she discovered that she could be a completely different parent. And parenting is leadership, as you very well know. In fact, most of our best stories we have about leadership started from our parenting mistakes or successes. And so this really started to happen. And one of the pinnacle stories for me is that we talk a lot about journaling. It's part of making yourself your number one job. It's not the only way, but it's a mechanism that really works for some people. And her son, who was in primary school, was playing a soccer tournament one weekend. And she found him in his bedroom journaling before the soccer tournament. And she said, "What are you doing?" He said, "No, he's preparing for the soccer tournament. He's journaling." He's 11 years old.
Yes.
You know, and that's again that multi-generational influence.
Yes. It makes such a big difference. What we do in our family is that when we have supper, we always say 3 wins for the day, 3 things that you're grateful for, and 3 visions that you have. And I'd actually noticed with my husband, there was something that he was affirming, and then it kind of happened.
Right.
And when it did happen, I said, "Do you remember, we've actually been affirming that," and it just fell into place without striving. Speaking about striving, you have got on your website, you've got an assessment tool. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in my work with leaders over the years, the two biggest problems we find is leaders that are in a survivor mode or leaders that are in a striver mode, and usually somewhere between the two. And in fact, maybe there's one day survivor and the next day striver. But these two are not conscious leadership. And the midpoint between two things that aren't conscious leadership isn't conscious leadership. So people vacillate between these. We all do. I do. Conscious leadership isn't arriving. Conscious leadership is awareness. So the survivor leader is one, they're putting everything in. They're trying to meet that day's client demands, delivery demands, whatever it might be. They're serving their teams, but they're very focused on today only. And good for them that they are surviving. It's better than the alternative.
Yes.
And so I always feel, wow, well done. But how can you ever take leave? How can you ever, because everything depends on you.
Yes.
And then very often people go to the other extreme of the striver. And so we call that the survivor is the people-focused leader, which is obviously a good thing. The striver is more the results-focused leader, the profit-focused leader. And they're always trying to learn something new, always putting extra effort in. And very often when they're in the striver mode, they're neglecting the people side. Or when they're in the people side, you're neglecting the results side. And so what we advocate, and that's what the assessment is about, is where are you in a triangle? If you put at the top the thriver, where are you plotting in this triangle? Because nobody's at any of the extremes. Everybody's somewhere in the plot. And how can we use that to leverage getting you to spend more time in the sort of thriver mode, where you've made yourself your number one job. You have capacity to understand the people needs and to meet them, capacity to understand the results needs and meet them, but doing it from an inner capacity, not just based on external pressure.
Yeah, there's a lot of learning. I can see myself in all of those different places. So there's a lot of work that I have to do. Now, I just want to speak about your strategy in terms of books. And you did this absolutely exquisite, full color, special format book. But you're also doing a paperback and you're doing an e-book. And then you've got little goodies. Tell us about the cards. They're gorgeous. We all, by the way, the whole team pulled out one today. I'll tell you what my one said. It says capacity, audacity, and tenacity will take you to the mountaintop. Why did you print these out?
So it started with the book. And the book, we wanted something that was almost like a coffee table book, something that a CEO could keep on their desk, and it would be color and a reference. And yeah, it was expensive to make, but it was really worthwhile. And at some point we went, these quotations and questions that are these full color pages are so important and so useful. Why not make a deck of cards? And the deck of cards could be that this leader could have it on their desk. They could draw one and say, what does this mean to me today as a leader? And if they want to, they can jump into the book and read something about it, or they can just take it for face value. Maybe it's a theme for a week. They can choose to use it how they want to. We've also started in a lot of the development leader transformation work that we do, workshops that we run, that we get everybody to pick a card. And when they introduce themselves, they say, what does this card mean to them as a leader? And everybody says that. So what does that card mean to you, Kim?
Wow. Capacity is something that I'm actively working on, trying to expand my capacity. And the audacity is that, I've got some of my own self-limiting beliefs. Yeah. And for me, audacity must say I have to fly in the face of that. I often say to my book coaching clients, when we were at school, you had to ask permission to go to the toilet. I mean, a basic need, you needed to ask permission. And so for my clients, I need to be able to say, break away from that. Yes. It's your dream. It's your book. Say, I can't, I matter, and I'm discarding that other thing. Because I say school was always, it's a good way for you to learn memory, thinking, teamwork, learning to comply when compliance matters, but we're not supposed to be factory workers. So sometimes you just got to break away and say, I give myself permission.
Right. I totally agree. And sometimes we think audacity as being bombastic or something. Actually, it's knowing your own inner truth. Why are you here? What's your reason for existence? Why were you brought on this planet? And surely we should be a little bit audacious about that.
Yes, because there can never be anyone exactly like you. I always say to my children, wear your safety belt. And they'll say, why? So I said, because if something bad happens to you, I will never, ever get another child exactly like you.
There we go.
So, Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. I'm going to pop down all of the links on where you can find Ian's book. And it's been such a pleasure. Any final words of advice to our writers?
Well, I just think get a book coach, get Kim involved, and the earlier the better. And then also this game plan. I think it's such a useful thing. What we're doing is we're getting people, we're giving them something free that gets them started or more momentum on their conscious leadership journey, and they get that for free, and it attracts people to be involved and to then be informed about the book and the launch, and this is the first of 3 books, so it's a good way to get people involved.
I'm very excited to see the new books. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Kim.